Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm fantastic today, Tim. I hope everyone who's listening is doing even better than I'm doing. Tim, are you doing even better than me, or is it about the same? You on the same plane as I'm on?
I'm probably on about the same plane as you this morning, but I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm really excited about this episode and to speak with another new friend. We're so lucky we get to make friends with all these authors and interesting people on this show. But in this episode, we speak with Stephanie Schorow. She wrote a book recently called Inside the Combat Zone, the stripped-down story of Boston's most notorious neighborhood. And it's something that we've been interested in for a while. Having grown up in the area, it's something we heard of and never really experienced in the way that she describes in this interview.
Yes, indeed. She's great. Stephanie is an author, a journalist, an educator, and she's a historian, and all of that experience is put to good use as she expertly weaves this fascinating narrative about the most notorious district in Boston. She introduces us to the politics, the performers, the gangsters. Most importantly, though, she introduces us to the residents and the neighborhoods who were affected by this, who lived through it all. She really shows us that it was more than just an adult entertainment district. It really was an experiment that not only became a cultural shift for Boston, but an example, good or bad, for other cities across the country. Such a great conversation here, and we're really looking forward to having her back on.
Yeah, I really hope you enjoy this conversation and enjoy Stephanie's book. All right, everybody, thanks a lot for listening. Make sure you check out Stephanie's books. They are fantastic, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. And make sure to follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
And we're going to break real quick so that we can get a word in from our sponsors, and we will be right back with our interview with Stephanie.
Welcome to the podcast, author Stephanie Schorow. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day outside and great fall in New England.
And a wonderful day to talk about a legalized area of adult entertainment in downtown Boston. But we will get to that soon. If anybody's watching on YouTube right now, I don't know how to resize the virtual background behind me, so I apologize for the woman's breasts, which are right behind me. But that is the cover of your book, Stephanie.
And let me just say that illustration is based on a real woman. She called herself the Devil's Own Mistress, who was a stripper who worked in the Combat Zone and also in Scully Square, and who continued to strip up until her 70s and 80s. So, you know, she was quite the gal. Angel Walker was her name. I think she died in the last few years, but she would be very flattered that her boobs live on in history.
And that's our episode. That's all we need.
There you go.
That is fantastic. Stephanie, I want to get into your books, but before that, I would just love to hear a little bit about your writing past.
Well, I like to call myself a recovering reporter. Basically, I was in journalism for many, many years. Including a stint at the Boston Herald, which was probably the high point of my journalism career. The Herald was a great place to work. And I've also done journalism for the Associated Press, the Tab newspapers. I freelanced for a number of organizations. I've never worked full-time for the Boston Globe, but I freelanced for them. And I continue to freelance for a host of different outlets at this point. But journalism was my first love. I had a degree in journalism from Northwestern University. And I bopped around the country at a lot of little papers till I ended up in Boston in 1989.
Cool. And the book that we're going to be talking about primarily today is your book called Inside the Combat Zone. It's been a goal of mine to introduce this moment in history. Do you consider yourself a bit of a historian as well?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think what they say about journalists is that we write the first draft of history. And so in doing, I've done a lot of different nonfiction books in Boston, and I feel like I'm writing the second and third draft of history. And often it's on topics, you know, like the Combat Zone, in the sense that these aren't the typical tourist founding fathers kind of Brahmin histories. These are about basically how people live their lives. Like this, I did a book called Drinking Boston, which is a history of the city's drinking habits. I did a book on the Brinks robbery, which lives in infamy, and Fires of Boston. I've written on Fires of Boston. Also with my friend and comrade in crime, Bev Ford, I did the Boston Mob Guide, which was just kind of a who's who of the bad boys, and they're mostly boys, in Boston over the histories. It's kind of an encyclopedia approach. We recommend it's a book that you pick up when you're reading the other mob books and you want to figure out who's who and what's what. It's a good reference book to have.
I'm going to go a little off the topic here. Circle back to drinking habits in Boston. Is this just one chapter that says like Guinness and whiskey?
No, no. There's a lot to the drinking history of Boston. One thing that I did in that book was go into Prohibition, because there had not been a book about what Prohibition was like in Boston at that time. Quite interesting how Boston obeyed and skirted the laws during that period. And the whole temperance movement has a great history in Boston. So I really delved into that whole area of when you ban something, what's the impact? And it's so funny because when I wrote that book, a lot of people, when I talk about it, people would say, oh, it's just like marijuana. And I'd say, you're right. And guess what? Sort of come to pass because during Prohibition, people could get booze with a prescription. It was still medically available. I actually found a prescription for that. And it seemed very similar to the medical marijuana aspect of it. So I guess it just shows that the more things change, the more they stay the same over the years.
Isn't that how Walgreens was? Am I remembering this correctly? That Walgreens was one of the first to...
I don't know that. That's an interesting factoid. But I do know that drugstores were places where you could get booze legally. And a lot of them were fronts for speakeasies as well. So there was a lot of shenanigans that went on. But there's a lot to Boston because, you know, of our the taverns in Boston were meeting places. That's where the Revolutionary War was planned in a tavern. The Green Dragon, allegedly. There were also cases of a lot of political activity happened in bars, like McGreevy's. I'll tell you something about that book. People said, oh, that must have been a lot of fun. And I said, well, there wasn't enough drinking involved. It was mostly research in libraries and interviewing people. Although I did sample some great cocktails over the research period.
I bet, yes. Very good. One obvious question, I guess, is why Boston? You've written several books about Boston.
I am not a native of the city. I have to make that clear right away. When I moved here, I just fell in love with the city. I moved around the country, so I really didn't have a place that I would consider home, even though I was born in Chicago, but I've been away for a long time. So Boston became my home, and the more I looked into it, the more I realized the history. There's so many stories about Boston. It's just a little bit below the surface. You can walk the places where people walked. In fact, when I do my lectures and I tell people about writing history, I said, go walk the areas that you're writing about. Go back. You can really get a sense of the way things are structured, even if things are totally changed. For example, my most recent book is on the 1872 fire that devastated the downtown of Boston. I did a lot of walking in that area. Now, it's all been rebuilt and there's no traces of it, but you still got a sense of how the streets aren't that different. So you really get a sense of it. But basically, Boston has a lot of great stories to tell. I'm just very lucky that when I moved here, I moved into a city that had stories to tell and the people to read them. This is a great city for the reading public. Let me put in a plug for the Boston Book Festival, which is happening in October. I've volunteered for that and I've gone to it for years. I'm finally going to be in it. I'm going to give a little talk there. When you go to that, thousands and thousands of people go to that. All readers. And it just makes you feel good about people's love of literature and the things that books bring.
The book festival is really a cool event that Boston hosts. So pretty cool that you're going to be there as a speaker.
Well, a reader on a panel. Not a headliner, but I'm there. I'm there, baby. So I'm happy about that.
Well, after people hear this interview next year, you'll be headlining.
Yeah.
With the Boston Mob Guide, I see that was published, I believe, before Whitey Bulger's death. What did you make of that?
We've updated it, but yeah, that was a shock. That was a shock to everybody who follows Whitey in any capacity. I mean, there are much better authors and researchers who have looked into his life And my comrade Bev was a former cop reporter, so she helped to cover his trial. She was very much involved with the coverage of that. She had a lot of background on that. But I still think it's astonishing. I'm glad that there's going to be some looking into it, because just something about it stinks. It really does. I mean, how could they not know that he was someone who's going to be in danger? It's not just Whitey. It's Whitey's relationship with the FBI and Whitey's relationship with law enforcement. That's the real scar. That's the real issue. And he's not the only one. Johnny Martirano, who was confessed to 19 killings, is not in jail. He's still walking around. Kevin Weeks, some other people were involved because they turned evidence, are still walking around. So it just underscores the kind of problems of our justice system, that it's not always as equal. I think there was a perception that, well, the mob, they're just killing other mob people. It's a very complicated story, but I think it really cuts deep into how we view crime and criminals in the city, and the disparities between how we view, and I'm going to say it, how we view white crime and how we view Black criminals. There's a lot of inequity. There's a lot of problems there. The mob book kind of underscored my thoughts about that.
I love it when we talk to somebody and the subject that we were intending to talk about, we haven't even touched it yet, and you've already given like so much great information. Definitely check out that mob book now, especially if you're going that deep into the inequities there.
We don't talk about it as much there, but I think it's inherent in some of the way we wrote it. Look at Martirano. The first victims were Black, and there wasn't any investigation. There was nothing. He's just walked away from that. Every time I think about that, it kind of boils my blood that happened. And it's just a chapter in Boston's history. But I will say the book is a mile wide and about an inch deep. We hit up the original Irish mobs, the Italian, the patriot. I mean, we go over a lot of area. It's really meant as an encyclopedia approach to help when in the other books that are written about the mob to really dive in, because if you start, you need a scorecard, really. I mean, there was the Irish mob war of the 1970s, and that got very complicated right away. We had to do a lot of work to piece out who did what to whom, when. And, it's part of Boston. We can't deny it. It's part of Boston's history. It really has an impact, and it has an impact particularly in the minds of people who live here. And let me give you another example of that. I'm going to segue into another book of mine, but I'm doing a rewrite of a famous fire of 1942 called the Coconut Grove Fire. And that is something that has never got the memorial and or the recognition from the city of Boston as it should have. Nearly 500 people died in that fire, November 28th, 1942, for reasons that are still a little bit murky. I did a rewrite of a previous book. But when I talked about that fire, it was unbelievable how many people came up with stories about that. And you see how trauma has an impact generation after generation. We're like 3 generations past the Coconut Grove. It's still affecting people. It's still having an impact. I mean, that's what made me say, I got to go back to this book and look into it and rewrite it and correct things, which were interesting, how new information bubbles to the surface. That's a joy of writing history. Faulkner says the past is never past. It's not, or never really dead. It's not even past. And I think that holds true whether you're talking about the Coconut Grove, we're talking about the mob, or even the combat zone. The combat zone still continues to have a hold on the minds of a lot of people in the Boston area. I continually get stories from people. There are another couple books being written about it. We're still finding things about it. But it was this unique time. And as a writer, I use the word unique carefully, meaning one of a kind, not unusual, a period in Boston's history and in the history of the country. That 60s, 70s was something that it's unlikely that we'll see again. It really reached into a lot of different aspects of how society was going on or being conducted. I mean, pornography was just part of it. Sex was just a little bit part of it. Gender relationships was part of it. Gay relationships, economic relationships, and the relationship of people to their city. This all came into it. And again, minority rights, the Chinese community that had the official combat zone kind of developed in their area and then sanctified in this area. And a lot of them began to say, why here? Why us? Put it in Beacon Hill, put it in South Boston. why in our community. So the story of the combat zone has feelers in all those different areas.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program. Yeah, you just hit on so many really interesting aspects of it. For anyone who doesn't know what the combat zone is, can you take us back to
Sure.
how it got started, what the country looked like at the time, like why Boston looked at other cities and said, we can't have it be like that? And you just brought up a huge point about where they actually placed it.
Right.
Take us back to the beginning of the combat zone.
Not a problem. It actually goes back to a place called Scully Square, which was the honky-tonk area of Boston. And it was in an area that is now Government Center. But that was kind of where you had the burlesque houses and the sailor bars and the tattoo parlors. And that disappeared early to late 60s due to urban renewal. Now, that didn't necessarily create the combat zone, but it helped to push there's a desire for these kind of services, and the desire moved to the downtown area. What really created the combat zone was economics. It was a very bad time for Boston. In the late 50s, early 60s, the Navy Yard was closing. There wasn't a lot of business. The downtown was really going downhill. People were moving to the suburbs. And so a lot of the businesses that were downtown were losing customers, and people were moving out of the city. So what you had in the downtown was just derelict blocks. The only businesses that would move in there were at first bars, and then they were kind of seedy bars, and then they were strip joints and topless bars. So that kind of pushed it. And that we're talking about the area below Downtown Crossing, lower Washington Street, from like the edge of maybe where Filene's used to be, or that area, down to Neelan Street. And then there was also in Park Square. So it was kind of spread out over that area. So what happened is in the 1960s, you had this economic push, plus you had the opening of morals and mores. We used to have in Boston a person who styled himself as the official city censor. He wasn't, but he kind of acted as such. And his name was Richard Sinnott, and he was quite a character. But he would actually go to all the burlesque shows and decide whether they should try to ban them or not. But he went to them. But what you had starting in like 1965 to 66 was the emergence along Washington Street of porno shops, what you call dirty bookstores or adult bookstores, X-rated movie theaters, and then of course the strip clubs. And this was the result of a number of factors, not only economics, I went into that, but changing morals. For example, in the 70s, we'll jump up to the 70s, a little movie called Deep Throat came out. I don't know if you've seen it or not, and that's okay. It's part of our culture. But Deep Throat was the first commercially viable X-rated movie. And there were others like The Devil Miss Jones and Behind the Green Wall or something like that. Anyway, that was kind of a signal that the country was changing, that you could, as I think even Roger Ebert said, you could take a date to Deep Throat. You had a more of acceptance. You also had a number of Supreme Court cases that said, look, there's something called the First Amendment, and what is offensive to you may not be offensive to someone else. And we have to be very careful about restricting freedom of expression. And there are a number of cases that said, the famous case where Potter Stewart said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And then there was a case called Miller versus California, which basically said you cannot, in essence, you can't ban pornography from your area. It is protected under First Amendment rights. There were some exceptions for that. It had to conform to community standards. But what happened is that nothing else would thrive in the downtown but these kind of businesses. And starting about 1966, they were filling the area, attracting a lot of business, becoming economically almost supportive of the city because they brought in money. Conventioneers were going there. There was the problem of prostitutes at this time, which I don't think anyone has, very few people have condoned. And that was a real problem. And there were drugs, and there were pickpockets, and there were crime. But the strip clubs, including places like the Naked Eye, the Piccadilly, the Pussycat Lounge, the Silver Slipper, you couldn't just shut them down. And the feeling from the city was, even if we could shut them down, they're just going to go somewhere else. Let's keep it contained. In the 1970s, they conceived this idea of zoning an adult entertainment district. And they created boarded for it. And they basically said, within this area, we will allow this kind of business to stay. And we will work with the people to make the safe have a better appearance, and also to be safer and maybe more attractive. In a way, what they were doing was what you saw later on in Vegas with the what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas kind of motif. It was like, we're going to create this area, it's going to be adult, we'll upgrade it a bit, and then as the economics improve, it will basically disappear on its own. You won't have to get rid of it, but as building prices going up and real estate goes up, it will disappear. It didn't exactly work out that way, but that was kind of the idea. And so what you had was this officially sanctioned area that which is still in the books, by the way. It's still in the books that this area is zoned for adult entertainment. The effort to work with the strip clubs and with the bookstores didn't work out because for a number of reasons. One, the bookstores and the pornographers were suspicious. They knew, people in the city were going to help them. Yeah, right. We not going to necessarily believe that. And then a few other things happened, including the murder in 1976 of Andy Popolo, who was a Harvard football player who was in the zone with his buddies through an altercation with men in the area who were described as pimps, or whether they were or not, I don't know, was stabbed to death because the assailants were two blacks and one Hispanic. And the Harvard students were mostly white, not all white, but Andy was white. It became a racial issue. And it really made people think, we've been trying to live with the combat zone, but maybe we can't. Maybe we shouldn't. The Chinese community, which originally, many of them actually supported the idea of a zoned, because they felt it would be controlled at the beginning. They began to turn against it because they began to see prostitutes and drug and other use in and around their community. And they started protesting against it. And it was interesting because as you saw their political clout growing, there were more restrictions on the zone and more of a willingness of the city people to get rid of it, to push it. Mayor Ray Flynn, was very much against the zone. He really tried to do things to get rid of it. Menino did too, but his was more to encourage development in that area. Things like the Millennial Project, in the movie theaters. I mean, that when that went in, and people don't realize that was considered, that's kind of dangerous. No one's going to go there. And of course they did. Little by little, the zone kind of faded away. And a couple reasons with the economics, basically prices went up. Also, one other thing, and that was the invention of the VCR and the use of tapes. And it turned pornography, or this act of watching pornographic movies or enjoying this kind of entertainment, from a public act to a private act. So you didn't have to go to a theater. You didn't have to even go out to go to a bookstore. You could just go to your regular own video shop and you go to their X-rated section, take it home, put the kids to bed, and have a grand old time. And so the VCR really helped to change the way people viewed pornography. And then their social morals changed. Strip clubs, I think at one point that was something fairly acceptable for a group of Harvard students after the end of the football seasons to go to the naked eye and party on. And that changed. Things changed. And then the internet came along, and that put the nail in the coffin. You could get everything you want, including prostitution, via your phone or via a computer, as opposed to having to go to a place. This comic zone lasted a longer time than you might expect, died a very, very slow death. Now, the one thing I'll say when I went to this, when I wrote my book, despite the cover of the book, is I was trying very hard not to have to do it as a male gaze kind of story. I really wanted to get the sense of who was there, who worked there. And a lot of the machine that really drove the combat zone in its heyday were the dancers, were the exotic dancers, the strippers, you could call them, but the women who got up on stage and did these and they were very elaborate, choreographed dances that would draw in customers. I talked to a number of dancers and who had some really interesting, eye-opening stories about what it was like to dance at the Naked Eye or the Pussycat or the Mousetrap. They had mixed feelings about it too. Brought in a lot of money, especially in the 70s. There weren't a lot of options for women in terms of employment without an education, except in the clubs, and that you can make a lot of money, really make a lot of money. But there was also there's danger involved. And although the men at that time were not allowed to touch the women, there were no pole dancing. There wasn't the tipping, the way they do it today with tucking things in, touching the woman, tucking it in there. It was a different setup. For example, the women were paid a lot more. And the way they made quote unquote tips was to do something called mingling. So after their performance, they'd come out and sit with men in the audience and say, hey, buy me a drink, buy me a drink. And they had to make a quota. of a certain amount of drinks that men would have to pay, and they would make their quota and then they get their wages for that. And a lot of the women didn't have any problems doing that, but it was, a little creepy. I mean, it's one thing to be on stage in these incredible outfits, and a lot of the women had incredibly beautiful outfits. I mean, it's not like it is today. I'll tell you, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. They did have to mingle. And so in talking to a lot of them, there was a lot of mixed feelings about this process. But a lot of the people who worked in the zone have affectionate memories about it, oddly enough. I talked to a number of people who felt it was kind of a place apart. It was in its weird sort of way welcoming to the gay community. There was a gay bathhouse, for example, and a lot of gay men went to the Pilgrim Theater, which had changed from a legitimate theater to an X-rated. It was a heterosexual X-rated theater, but a lot of them had encounters in the Pilgrim. And today we might look at that, and that's kind of not so healthy and kind of dangerous, but at the time it was one of the few places where gay men could go and meet people and kind of express their sexuality. And some of the dancers were transsexuals in a time. It's kind of funny now when transsexuality is coming under attack. And when I did my book, I'd met great characters. For example, there was a woman named Hetty Jo Starr, and she was a man. She had been a man. She had transitioned to the woman's. This is in the 1950s, so this was very early on, one of the first ones. And she became a designer, and she became known for her designs of women's outfits for stripping. And they were sumptuous. They were like, women were like arrayed like goddesses with rhinestones and feathers and all this beautiful stuff. And her designs, they're just gorgeous. And she was this amazing character who designed outfits for women. One of the strippers I talked to, she dancer named Julie Jordan, Hetty Jo convinced her to become Miss Bicentennial in 1976. So she designed her this whole Miss Bicentennial dress that she went out and kind of got out of at the very end. But she even did a dance during an event organized on Government Plaza. A bunch of kind of crazy hippies decided, let's have a patriotic strip. So she came out and stripped to, not all the way down, to John Philip Sousa. As a Herald note, it said, people pay more attention to that than the poetry that was recited. As far as my research, I went to the two strip joints that are left in the combat zone. One's a glass slipper, which was a silver slipper, now it's glass. And one is, what's it called? It used to be the Naked Eye, and it has another name now. So I forget what it is. But anyway, that one's more of a chain. Anyway, I went to both of them, and it's pretty dismal in a lot of ways. There's not a lot of choreography. I mean, the women can be very talented, but they don't start out they start out with with skimpy costumes that disappear by the end of the night. The way these places are set up, they have televisions up there, they have poles and stuff. And as I noted, not even a sight of a naked, writhing woman on a stage will keep a man from looking at his cell phone. So I used the slide of you've just entered the combat zone, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. But now I say you've entered the combat zone, you have nothing to fear but overpriced lattes.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
But you're right, the glass slipper is still there. When we were looking into this, again, for research, yeah.
Yeah.
Ended up going in there. Yeah,
good,
it is.
Good. Yeah, that's an old one, yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, I went there and I ended up hanging out and talking to one of the dancers there. I was doing the thing. Can I buy you a drink? No, honey, sorry. But we sat and chatted for a while, and I was being kind of I teach college, so she was like a college age, so I was saying, be careful, keep a journal of what you're doing. You might be able to do something with it some way. So it was like I was really, my maternal professorial instincts were triggered by that. I'll tell you something interesting about this whole experience is that there's been a reclaiming of burlesque and stripping by women. I don't know if you've been to any neo-burlesque shows lately. Before the pandemic, they used to have them in Harvard Square a lot. I think they called them the Church of Slut or some funny name. But I actually gave a talk at one of them, and it was great. All these women, and it's women dancing, women in the audience, women whooping and howling, women owning the profits, which is different from the combat zone, and recreating these kind of this joy of body, if you will. It's so different from the way it used to be. It's funny, I remember at one of those events, I showed a slide of the Naked Eye. I don't know if you have it there, but it said something like all college girl review. And I said, well, all you English majors, look, you have you have a future here. The one thing I regret in my book is I wasn't able to reach out to and speak to a lot of prostitutes, and there were a lot of prostitutes and pickpockets there in that time. And I think those are the women who are lost to history. And appropriate for a crime podcast is there are a lot of unsolved murders of women in the combat zone, including a young woman. She was like barely out of high school, or she was in high school, and she was murdered, and they never found out who killed her. And it just haunts me, because you wonder if they really, how much they looked, how much the feeling was, oh, they deserve it, that having that kind of lifestyle, you deserve to that kind of thing. But there have been a number of unsolved murders in that area that are heartbreaking.
Was there any crossover between the Combat Zone book and the Boston Mob Guide?
Not specifically, but in general, many of the strip clubs were owned by mobsters. The Venice brothers, or Venus brothers, they were called, owned a lot of them. But it was kind of hard to figure out exactly who owned what in that, because they hid themselves behind different shills and different false companies. I had one gentleman who worked with the Boston Redevelopment Agency. He actually worked to try to upgrade the Combat Zone back in the day, and he felt there weren't a lot of mob connections there, because he said it would have been better run if there were mobsters there. However, other sources tell me no, there were a lot of mobsters who had interests in all the clubs. I had one guy tell me about walking in and seeing the take from a weekend of the stacks and stacks of cash all being counted and not being reported and that kind of thing. So definitely the mob was very much behind a lot of that. And here's an interesting story. There's a gentleman who did a lot of the bookstores, Palladino, I think it was his name. And he was connected with the Angulos, who were the mob in the North End. So there was a connection there. There was a connection. But he ran some of the bookstores there. And although she wouldn't tell me the name of her client, he was defended, his bookstores' First Amendment rights to exist were defended very ably by a very interesting lawyer who was a former nun. And Sister Regina Quinlan, she was a nun, and then she left and went to law school, defended a lot of the bookstores there on First Amendment grounds. And she was an amazing woman. I had a long talk with her, and she still, to this day, defends that and says, well, it's not my cup of tea. I knew what I was getting into. I don't agree with it. But just because I don't agree with it doesn't mean someone else doesn't have a right to look at that thing, should they so desire. Now we're into child pornography and things like that. This was before that. This was more, I hate to say it, just your basic pornography, that kind of thing. It does emphasize that in looking at the Combat Zone, you have to think about what is the balance between personal liberty and public safety. That comes into areas like prostitution. Okay, it's one thing for a woman who decides that she's going to be a sex worker. What about a 14-year-old girl or 14-year-old boy who's forced into it? It's a different conundrum there. In terms of writing about this, I was deeply affected by the research, and I spent a lot of time mulling in my own mind, how do I feel about this? How do I, as a feminist, write about this in a way that is compassionate toward the women, but never loses sight of the fact that, as one of them said, they were sex workers. Even if they didn't perform sex on some level, they were sex workers when they did their dances.
Given the state of the country at the time, when pornography was popping up everywhere, in New York it was taking over, and ultimately, was this a good thing, centering it in a certain area, zoning it? I know it's like revisionist history, but what do you think Boston would have been if they didn't do this?
Well, the people who zoned for it, the BRA people, would definitely say it was a good idea. I talked to a number of people who said, look, it worked. Look at it. Look at the place now. It worked. Took a long time, but it eventually worked because they were able to control it. The police would have an entirely, I talked to a detective who thought it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of to do this. And so he would say, no, it was a mistake. It cost a lot of lives. It hurt a lot of people. So I think there's, not to dodge your question, but to say that there's arguments on both sides of that discussion of whether it was ultimately, I think good is a word I wouldn't apply to it. Did it eventually result in a better downtown? If you can afford it now. It's funny, I took a walk with a young man, no, he's not young now, but he was his father ran something called House of Pizza, which was a
King of Pizza.
Yeah. which was in the Boylston building there. Yeah. And he basically grew up in the comment zone. So we did a walk down there and he's telling me, well, this is where this was and this was this one. And he looked around, he said, wow, I wish I bought in because this stuff is like sky high. And then he looked at the ground and said, they haven't done anything with the sidewalk. It looks just like it did back then with these weird cobblestone streets and things. So it's interesting. And I think there's some irony there. I mean, the Chinese population struggled so hard to get rid of this, upgrade their neighborhood, get rid of the comment zone they did, and then now they're facing with being priced out of their own area. And there's a lot of controversy about that. And, at one point, the downtown was becoming more of a neighborhood. I did a story for the Globe on this, that people were moving in. They were creating more of a neighborhood things. There were better restaurants. There was Roach Brothers, there's a grocery store, it's services. But I keep hearing about in these huge complexes, people buying the apartments as investments, and they sit empty because they're just sitting there as investments. And I find that disturbing. I don't think that's good for the city.
You actually brought up King of Pizza, which is something that I wanted to talk about. It was Tony Pascali.
Yeah, I believe it was. Yes.
Ended up talking to him a couple of times on the phone. They have a new place that is right across the street from the Boston Garden.
Right.
He had such amazing memories of that time. And this was where pimps and police officers would pop in and college students, and there was never really that many issues there. And if there was, like, he was almost looked at as almost like a safe haven. Was that like the impression that
was the impression I got? Yeah. As a matter of fact, and that's what I think that we have to recognize about the commons, that there were businesses there. Yes, there were a lot of strip joints, but there were other businesses kind of sandwiched in there. It's a complex history there, especially towards in the 70s, 80s, mostly strip joints and or adult entertainment. But, at one point, the city put in a division of motor vehicles in the old Liberty Tree building, which used to have pornography there because they were trying to get people to go there. That was one of their redevelopment efforts, was to put a division of motor vehicles there to encourage people to go there.
That's really funny. The Liberty Tree monument or the Liberty Tree marker there, that's really historical, and tourists go there.
I need to look into it. There's a plaque in the sidewalk, and that's gone now, and they've created this park. They've been playing around with that park for years. I mean, I remember when John Sloan, who I just mentioned, SBRA, he developed this park and he had an opening. Mayor White wouldn't show up, and no one would show up except Barney Frank came because he was in favor of that. And some strippers from the 2 o'clock lounge came out and were there for the opening of that Liberty Tree Park. And now it's changed again. So it's funny that they keep playing around with it. And there's still homeless people there. There's still panhandlers in that area. I mean, it's an urban, it's always going to be an urban neighborhood. But, is it better now? I mean, of course, you don't have the priority, but a lot of people will say, yeah, but it's kind of bland now. You just have these condos and you have these, coffee shops and stuff. I mean, the good news is that the theaters have all revived. When I moved to Boston, they were dead. There was nothing there, but those have all revived. So now you have people there. I mean, I remember when I first moved to Boston, it was scary at night in downtown where people weren't there, and now it's packed. Well, post-pandemic, considering what happened during the pandemic. And there's Emerson students there and Suffolk students there. So there's a lot. So I think that you could say is good. I mean, there's no question that is a good development. Though that there's some lessons here. I mean, you can look at what's happened in the Seaport District. I don't think that's it's great to have all these buildings there, but I don't think it's the neighborhood I think it could have been better.
It could have been a lot better. Every time I go down there, I feel like Marty McFly in Back to the Future 2, when he's like looking around and things are like swooping around his head or like, I feel like it's the opening credits of Futurama.
Yeah.
Where it's just like craziness everywhere. You would never know now. You go down there and it's like they just keep building and building and building, but the water's like right there. It's like, how do you keep doing this? How is it not sinking? There's so much stuff on this like small area.
There's no access to the water. I mean, you're like, yeah, the water's right there, but do you see it? I mean, they put building in front of the beautiful ICA building, which was the largest building. You can't see it. I think Menino, there was this feeling that any development was good, and I think that was and is a mistake for the city of Boston and for other cities as well, because you've got to think carefully about who are you building for? Do you want to create a vibrant community? I mean, I'm not arguing for a return to the combat zone. Don't
I think that's what we're hearing here.
Yeah, but
lobbying for several combat zones.
Let's bring it back. No, it's funny because the people who tried to zone for the combat zone were well intentioned. I think particularly the city was really trying to look at it from a viewpoint of, how can we make this a better neighborhood and not just bulldoze everything. And like I said, mixed success. The other thing was that the things were different back then. There wasn't the division of right and left. Things were pro-development versus anti-development. There was more nuance there. There's more thought to it. I think that's another lesson from the Combat Zone. There's a lot more to that story than just a bunch of dirty bookstores and strip joints. Avoiding the male gaze, avoiding the way to typecast women and or prostitutes and or the cops or the people who went there. And dirty little secret was it was very popular for conventioneers, and a lot of people realized it brought in stuff to Boston. Whether you agree with that or not, it did.
Tell us about your new book, if we still have a few minutes here, The Great Boston Fire.
Sure. It's funny because the picture that you're showing behind you is almost on the edge of where the fire was. It was a little farther up the street. I became fascinated with this fire when I saw pictures of the devastation. In 1872, there was a fire that just wiped out the downtown, and it looked like a nuclear bomb went off. And I just was fascinated by it because I said, how come we don't know about it? How come, because it was as expensive per acre as the Chicago fire, more expensive per acre than the Chicago fire. But it didn't have a large loss of life, but it had a lot of ramifications and a lot of things that grew out of it. So I wrote a book on that fire. I sort of go down the rabbit hole on a lot of the different things that led up to the fire, who got blamed for the fire. The guy who warned that Boston could burn like Chicago was the one who was eventually blamed for the fire. That's the newest book that's out. And you look at that and you say, oh my God, how did Boston ever rebuild? But it did. We did. And fairly quickly, as a matter of fact. The other book I have coming out is on a more tragic, devastating fire, which will come out in another month, which is on the Coconut Grove fire of 1942. That's a difficult story. I went back to it. It gave me nightmares again, but I went back to it and put together an update of my previous book on that. Again, one of those stories in Boston that has a lot of ramifications, and firefighters around the country will come and go to the site of the, well, they can't really now go to the site of the Coconut Grove fire. This condos now on that spot, although the last time I was there was all under scaffolding because apparently the water system had broken. They kept pouring water on the condos, which, given that there was a huge fire there, almost 80 years ago, I thought was kind of ironic,
That's kind of eerie.
It's kind of eerie. Yeah, it was. But that's a depressing book. But I'll just mention one other one that'll come out in the spring, which is a project I'm doing with, it's kind of a women's oriented project with Friends of the Boston Harbor Island, or we found a diary that was kept in 1891 by 4 women who went out to Great Brewster Island in the Boston Harbor Islands, which if you've not been there, you should go to the Boston Harbor Islands. But anyway, they left this journal with photographs and illustrations, and it's this marvelous look at what women's lives were like in the 19th century, and what they put in the diary and what they left out is very interesting. So those are the projects I'm working on right now.
So we're lining you up for at least 4 more interviews.
Well, that's very sweet. Very sweet of you. Yeah.
We're going to do that one. We're going to do a more in-depth one on the Boston fire. I'm so glad you're writing the book on Coconut Grove, because if it's going to be anything like your book Inside the Combat Zone, it will tell the entire story, and you're going to not just get the surface level broad strokes. Your book about the combat zone was you went through the whole spectrum and showed the impact that it had decade by decade. And it was it's so thorough and so good. So I'm so glad to hear that you're doing the Coconut Grove fire.
Well, I appreciate that. I think as a writer, I've been blessed to have an opportunity to write about all these topics. I mean, Boston's history is really rich in that way. And there really are threads that you were asking about, how my book related to the combat zone. Actually, there are threads that go through all my books. It's interesting that I've seen things that kind of get repeated over and over again. And some of the lessons, like just one thing on the 1872 fire, because it relates to the pandemic of all things. But the fire chief at that time warned the city that picture, what he said, this is going to happen. If we don't do something, something's going to happen. They ignored him, and it did. And then he was blamed for it. And the thing about this firefighter, John Damrell, he didn't give up. He became the city's first building commissioner, spent another 25 years trying to make sure that Boston would be a safer place to live. You don't hear much about him today, but he really helped to make it really helped to curb the problem of fires that were really wiping out a lot of cities at the time. But I really thank you. Thank you so much for your interest in my work, and I wish you good luck with the podcast.
Thanks for coming on. It's been a delight talking with you, and I'm sure people will be interested in purchasing your books. Where would you direct them to do that?
I would encourage them to go to the local independent bookstore and order. If they don't have it, they will order it for you. It'd be great. And then if you live in this area, come to any one of my events. I'll happy sign for you. You can also go through Amazon or Barnes and Noble. That's fine. And if you really don't have a lot of money, go to your local library and they will order it for you. So there are, and I encourage people to do that. Go, use your local libraries, support your local bookstores, and come to the Boston Book Festival because I will be there.
Right. When is that?
October 29th. I'm there in the mid-afternoon. I'm on a panel of local authors. Go there and enjoy how much people love to read.